Welcome to this class on etching glass. I'm Kelly Wayment, and today I'll teach you how to use Silhouette etching cream and your Silhouette machine to create some etched glass projects. Etching cream is a chemical that will permanently etch custom designs and text onto glassware and mirrors. You'll learn how to etch glass from start to finish, beginning with creating your stencil design, then using that stencil with etching cream to transform your glass projects. I'll share all my tips along the way. Here's what you'll need to get started with glass etching: etching cream, stencil vinyl, transfer tape, a hook tool, and a scraper tool. These 5 basic components are all included with the Silhouette Glass Etching Starter Kit. You can also purchase them individually, and if you've worked with vinyl before, you might already have some of those things. In addition, here are some other things I use when etching glass: a foam brush or other applicator, and that's personal preference, gloves, eye protection, glass cleaner, paper towels, measuring tape or ruler, masking tape, skinny craft sticks, a protective surface, and a sink with running water. You can use most smooth glass items for etching, including mirrors. Flat objects and straight cylinders are great etching items, but uneven or round surfaces can make it hard for vinyl to get a perfect seal against the glass. You might run across some glass that won't take the etch, like some glass casserole dishes and pie plates. You might want to test an inconspicuous area first if you can. You can use the Silhouette Cameo, Portrait, or Curio for cutting the vinyl we use for etching. The steps to creating a glass etched piece are really quite simple. I'll explain more about the fine details as we work through some projects, but in each case you'll create a stencil design, cut it out from stencil vinyl and weed it, use transfer tape to apply the design to the glass surface, apply etching cream to the exposed design and let it sit, then scrape away the excess cream, rinse the glass, and remove the vinyl stencil. Let's get started. For our first project, we'll etch a flat glass cutting board. Flat objects are the easiest to work with. I'll measure my cutting board. I've got at least 7 inches between the legs. I need to pay attention to that. And it's 5 3/4 inches high. And so now we'll just move into Silhouette Studio to create that design. Because I'm using stencil vinyl, that comes on a 9-inch roll. So I'm going to set up the page size in the page setup panel to 9 inches wide by 11 inches high. And we can adjust the height later based on the design. And again, since I'm cutting from the roll, I'm going to set my cutting mat to none. You can cut directly from the roll with the Cameo or Portrait, but if you're using the Curio, you'll need to use a cutting mat and adjust the page size and mat accordingly. Now, anytime you create a stencil, which we usually do for glass etching, we need to make sure that the stencil doesn't lay on any curves or bumps. And for the glass cutting board I'm going to use, that has those legs on it. We want to avoid placing the stencil on the legs. We're going to be etching the back side where the legs are. So I'm going to start by drawing a rectangle. So I'll go with my rectangle drawing tool. And I want the top and bottom edges to match the height of my cutting board. And then the side borders I want to fall within the cutting board legs. So I'm going to make this 7 inches wide and 5.75 inches high. So I can get that pretty close, and then I'm going to use the scale tool up in the quick access toolbar. So I'm going to set that to 7 inches exactly. Oh, let's make sure that's unlocked. 7 inches wide and 5.75 inches high. And I've already opened my chef design from the library, so I'm going to drag it inside the rectangle and resize it to about 4.2 inches wide. That looks pretty good. Now this rectangle is going to act as a barrier for the etching cream. So whenever we're glass etching, we need to leave an outer border around the design. We don't want to get the edge too close, the design edge, too close to the edge of the stencil, because any etching cream beyond that border will etch into exposed glass. So my top and bottom borders are actually pretty close to the design, but this border also goes all the way to the edge of my glass and it won't leave it exposed, so I'm okay this time. And most of the time that we're doing glass etching, we can leave the design just as we see it. But I'm going to etch on the back side of the cutting board so my cutting surface stays smooth. So that means I need to mirror this design since I'm going to be etching the back. So I'll just right click and choose flip horizontally. The other way to do that is object, mirror, and flip horizontally up with the menu choices. Okay, so now I'm going to center this design within the rectangle. I'll select both and I will choose center in the quick access toolbar. And then these are where I want them, so I'm going to group them also in the quick access toolbar so they can move together. And I'm just going to position that within the cut borders on the page. So now my stencil design is ready to cut, and I've already got my page set up the way I need it. So we'll move into the send panel. And I want my material for stencil vinyl to be vinyl glossy. And I want my action to be cut, and my tool needs to be the blade. I'm using a Cameo 3, so I've got it on auto blade, but of course you could choose a ratchet blade if that's what you're using. And I'll check over here in the bold preview area, and those lines are bold that I want to cut, and so that's great. And after I've got my stencil vinyl loaded into the machine, I can go ahead and click send. So because I'm using my 9-inch vinyl, I need to adjust the rollers so it's in the position that will roll the 9-inch width. So I'm going to go ahead and put that to the unlocked position, slide that roller to unlocked, and then I will just slide these over. I'm looking for that groove. So when it settles in that groove, I'll put that back to the lock position and then lock my roller back in place. So I'm going to load my 9-inch vinyl, just looking for that guideline, and make sure that those rollers are going to be completely gripping on both sides. And press load. And as long as that's evenly loaded all the way in the back, then I can press send in my software and get that cutting. So my vinyl's cut, and I just need to trim it off of the roll. Now for weeding, I always start with the outside first, because I know I want that rectangular stencil to stay in place. So I don't get confused if I start outside of the stencil. And then I just work towards the center. So that stencil's in place, so the next piece touching it needs to be removed. And make sure when you're doing this weeding that you don't lose any of these little inner pieces like letter centers. You're actually pulling away the design that you want to etch. So I'm etching these letters, so it's the letters that I'm picking away with my weeding tool. Okay, so now that that is all weeded, we are ready to use transfer tape across the design. And you do have transfer tape that comes with the stencil vinyl. And when I'm doing glass etching with a stencil, I actually just need my transfer tape to be large enough to cover the design itself. So I don't need it to go all the way to the edge of the stencil. want to make sure that it covers all of the design inside so it can pick that all up together. I use my scraper tool to get that on there. And now I can pick this all up in just one piece and apply it to my glass. And remember, we're going to etch the back side, and we want to make sure that the stencil does not get on those legs to create any gaps in the vinyl. So I made this border the same as my cutting board, so I can just use that top edge to get that lined up straight, and I just kind of want to center it. Once I've got that placed, I just want to carefully smooth it out so I don't have any bubbles or gaps right where the stencil design is, where it's going to be etched. If there's little bubbles on the outside that aren't where the etching is, that's actually okay. I'm not worried about that. I just want the glass to be covered in a tight seal where all of that etching goes. So once I have that down, I can pull away my transfer tape. Go slowly, make sure you don't pull up any pieces that are supposed to stay on the glass. All right, and so now I'm just going to go through and press down and make sure that all of those edges have the vinyl nice and tight against the glass. We don't want any etching cream seeping under those edges. Okay, that looks good. And so now I'm almost ready for the etching cream, but I have, just as a precaution, I like to add masking tape around those edges. Just make sure that I don't let my etching cream go beyond my stencil borders. Okay, so that is ready for the etching cream. Now I want to point out that any areas that aren't completely smooth at these borders where the etching cream is supposed to be applied, if you have any bubbles that you can't press out or bumps and gaps, you're better off just taking the whole thing off and cutting it and reapplying it, because the etching cream is permanent, and once it's on there, you can't do anything to change it. So just make sure that that's nice and smooth, and it's better to redo it at the beginning instead of ruining your glass. So we'll go ahead and go with the etching cream. It can separate a little bit, and so I always give it a stir, and these skinny little craft sticks are great for stirring that. And then I'll either pour it on or use my sponge applicator or just smooth it on with my little craft stick. And I just want to make sure that all of that design is covered. And the etching cream over time might change color, and it might get thicker if it starts out thin. It works the same though, so even if it gets thicker or changes color over time, you're fine to still keep using it. I just want that to be an even layer. Make sure I'm covering all of the design. Okay, so now we just let that sit for 30 to 60 seconds. And when that's done sitting, we'll go ahead and scrape it back off and put it back in the container because you can use it again. We want to make sure when we are scraping that off that we don't scrape it really hard and push any of the etching cream into any gaps. We don't want it to slide under the vinyl. So we'll just kind of scrape that off and put it back in here to save it. Okay, so once most of that is off, I'll just use a paper towel and kind of wipe off the rest of that, the thick area. And again, I don't want to push too hard. And keep an eye on your gloves. If you get a little etching cream on your gloves, you don't want to be touching exposed glass. But this looks good, and so I'm ready to take it to a sink with running water and we'll just rinse it off. So now all we need to do is remove all of the stencil and any masking tape. And this just gets thrown away. So at this point, if it tears or anything, it doesn't matter. So you'll need to go through and feel with your fingers once you think you've got that off. Make sure you haven't left any pieces behind, including little centers of letters or anything. So etching kitchenware like this makes a great handmade gift for newlyweds or as a housewarming gift. You can also personalize glass with your text tools. So you might want to put somebody's name on the cutting board, or even on a frame. It's really fun to etch all kinds of glass like that and personalize it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, flat surfaces are pretty easy to etch. So that includes flat sides of a votive, or just since cylinders are completely flat, you can etch a cylinder type vase or any kind of jar that's flat. Now remember, you usually cut your stencil with the design not mirroring and etch on the top side of the glass. In the next section, I'll show you how to create a design and etch on a tapered glass, which behaves a little differently than perfectly flat objects. Now we'll talk about etching tapered objects that do not have equal widths at the top and bottom. This drinking glass is a good example where the sides are straight and flat, but the top and bottom don't match. When you apply vinyl to a tapered object like this, especially if the design is generally horizontal, the vinyl will curve as it's applied. You've got a few options to deal with curved or tapered glass. First, you can avoid horizontal designs. If a design is mostly square, circular, or vertical, you may not notice much warp as you apply it. Also, try organic shapes like leaves and branches or flowy text without a baseline like I used on these mugs. That way, you won't notice if it curves a little. Second, you can skip using a stencil altogether. Just apply separate small vinyl designs individually along the glass. Then etch the entire glass surface, leaving clear designs among a frosted glass background. Placing small designs individually or in vertical strips, like I did on this vase, helps you avoid curve or warp that happens when applying larger design or stencil on a curved or tapered object. Another option is to use the conical warp tool if you have Designer Edition Plus or Business Edition. I want to create a top border for this glass, and there's really no way to do it with a single piece stencil unless you have the software compensate for that curve. If you have a design that spreads horizontally, the curve as you apply the vinyl to the tapered object is going to be especially apparent, and the conical warp tool corrects for that. So I've opened this Celtic border design, and I'm going to rotate it horizontally with the green dot. I'll hold my shift key so that'll snap to a horizontal line. And I don't need to resize it yet because I can do that as part of the warp process. So I'm going to get my rectangle tool, and this time I'm going to draw it to be 8.1 inches wide and 1.5 inches high as my stencil. So I'll use the scale tool up in the quick access toolbar. It's unlocked. So 8.1 is the width and 1.5 is the height. Now I've chosen 8.1 inches because that just makes it 1/10 of an inch longer than this design that's exactly 8 inches. I want the width to be very close to wrap it around the cup. Now if you are doing a different design and you're not wrapping it around the entire glass, you probably can and should make the borders of your rectangle larger for that protective stencil. I'm going to center these together, again with my quick access toolbar, and I'll go ahead and group it up there also. I do want this stencil to be curved with the rest of the design, which is why I'm drawing the border before applying the warp. Now I'll open the warp panel. Down here on the side, it's this one that looks like a grid that's kind of warped. And I want to go to the conical warp tab, and that is available to me in Designer Edition Plus or in Business Edition. My screen's a little bit small, so I'll drag that panel up so I can see the whole thing. Now with my border selected, I'm going to choose Conical Warp Selected Shapes. And you can see that has started to curve. Now I just need to input my glass measurements. So the top is 3.375 inches across, and the base is 2.375 inches across. And then the height of my glass is 5.75 inches. Now, I always use, you should always use your slider here or your input to resize your design once you've warped it. You wouldn't want to resize with the corner handles once you've applied a warp. So we're going to put this as big as it can go. So I'll just drag my slider all the way to the edge. And the reason for that is I just want to be able to have that design wrap all the way around the glass as much as possible. And I want to adjust my vertical position to 0 so I can use this top edge of my stencil as a guide as I apply it to the top edge of the glass. Now if you're not doing a border design along the top edge, these top 3 inputs here are still going to be what you input for the size of your tapered surface. And then your resize slider adjusts the size of the design, and your vertical slider is going to be where you intend to place the design relative to the top or bottom of the glass. So this looks good for what I want to do, and so I'll click Apply. Now if that comes ungrouped, we'll just go ahead and click Group again in the Quick Access toolbar, so I can move it around where I need to. This curve on the top, and well, the curve of the whole design is actually going to straighten out as we apply it to the tapered glass. Let's rotate this sideways again because I need to cut it lengthwise on my roll of vinyl. Let's go ahead and check the page setup. That is still 9 inches wide for my roll of vinyl and still no cutting mat, so that's where I need it. And we'll go to the Send panel and just check the material is still on glossy vinyl and cut with my auto blade. So that is all ready to go. And so once I have that vinyl loaded into the machine, I can go ahead and click Send. So I have my stencil vinyl that I've taken off of the machine and trimmed it down off the roll. And so now I'm going to go ahead and weed that again. Remember, when you're working with a stencil, it's easiest to start with the very outside edge, that you can take that off, and then work your way in. So in this case, I'm just going to be removing the border, the Celtic border design, and leaving all of those inner pieces in place. All right, so I have my design all weeded, and now it's just time to apply the transfer tape. And I've trimmed this down to make sure that it covers all of the inner pieces on that design. So I'll just place it there, kind of in the middle, and use my scraper tool to get that all stuck to the transfer tape. Okay, so with this glass, I'm going to just put down a little cloth to keep it from rolling. And because I created my stencil before I warped it, it curves with the rest of the design, and I'm actually going to use the top edge of the stencil to lay across the top of the glass, kind of as a guide. And again, I start at the center and make sure I'm watching the stencil itself, not necessarily the transfer tape. Okay, once I've got that in the center, then I will just carefully apply it and watch that top edge of my stencil to just roll across the top edge of the glass. Smooth it from the center, working outwards. I don't want to get any bubbles in there. That's what's going to cause issues with the etching cream seeping underneath. So I want that to be a nice tight seal. Okay, that looks pretty good, so I can take off my transfer tape. We don't want any of this stencil to overlap any other pieces of vinyl, or it'll cause a little bump. And so if you ever have your stencil lifted up or overlapping anything, you just need to get a craft knife and kind of trim that away so it's all smooth against the glass. So I'll just carefully peel that away. Peel away the transfer tape. Just go slowly and make sure you don't lift up any of those little pieces in the middle that should stay in place. Okay, now I will just press that really well against all of the design. Make sure that's got a nice tight seal. If you do find that you have any bubbles or creases that you can see that you can't smooth out, you are really just better off pulling that off and starting over. Okay, we needed to make this stencil pretty small so we could wrap that all the way around and not have anything overlapping. So I do need to use masking tape to make sure that any of those glass areas are not exposed. That might take some etching where you don't want it. So I'm going to go ahead and put on some masking tape, and it will curve up the side of the glass. So I'm doing some smaller pieces and just overlap those and make sure you're not covering any of the design, but you are protecting the glass underneath the stencil. And again, along the top, this is going to get kind of messy. We're going to use a lot of etching cream, so I want that extra protection along the top as well. And I am going to tuck that in there a little bit. Just helps protect that top edge from any extra etching cream. Okay, and finally I want to make sure that I get this little gap where the stencil did not meet. So I'll just take some masking tape and trim a little bit with scissors and make sure I get that area covered. Okay, so I have all of this glass covered except for the design where I want it to etch. I'm ready to apply the etching cream. Get my etching cream again and give it a little stir and just start to apply this to the design. And watch out for those gloves. Make sure you're not getting any on your gloves and transferring that to the rest of the glass. An all-around design like this can get pretty messy, so make sure you've got your surface covered with something that will protect your counter. Okay, that looks pretty good, so we'll just let that sit for up to a minute and then we'll wipe it off. Ready to go ahead and scrape this off. Making kind of a mess, but any of that can be saved, just scrape off and scoop back into your bottle. I want to get most of it off. Just be careful that you're not really scraping it hard and getting that under the edges of your stencil. Okay, now that I've got most of that off, I'll go ahead and wipe it down with a paper towel. I can actually save some of that too. Check my gloves, make sure I'm not transferring anything. I'll just wipe that gently. Okay, and I'm ready to take that to the sink and get that rinsed off. So we'll get that dried off and peel away the stencil. It's actually a lot easier to get your stencil off all those sticky parts if you've already taken your gloves off. And if you ever notice any extra etching cream after you have rinsed that off, you're okay to rinse it again after you take off the stencil vinyl, or just wipe it or clean it with glass cleaner. And we'll just spend some time getting all those little pieces off. Use your fingernails or your hook tool, whatever works best for you. Now, you'll probably run across a lot of glass that's tapered that you might want to etch. If you choose your designs carefully, you might not notice any warping. But if you think you'd like to etch glass on tapered surfaces very often, I do highly recommend investing in Designer Edition Plus or Business Edition. I want to briefly touch on some troubleshooting issues. If you get designs that are not crisp after etching, here are a few things to watch for. If there's only one or two trouble spots, like on this glass, it's an application issue. There were probably gaps at the design edges, and we should have pressed the vinyl better and pay attention better before etching the design going forward. Gaps occur more often on rounded surfaces, so you want to try avoiding placing large stencils on obvious curves. Now, if you have multiple spots that don't look crisp and clean, and it's kind of an overall lack of crisp lines, that probably means it's a vinyl issue. Your vinyl adhesive may not be strong enough, so you want to try a newer roll or try a different type, like permanent or glossy vinyl. Unfortunately, there's not a way to correct etched pieces. If you can't smooth out gaps at the design edges once the vinyl is applied, you're better off peeling it off completely and starting over before applying the etching cream. Thanks for joining me and learning about glass etching. By now you should know the tools and supplies you need, how to create your stencil designs, how to cut and weed your stencils, and the process for applying stencils and etching cream. I hope I've also sparked some ideas on different glass objects you can use for your etching projects. If you're just starting out, you probably have some glass in your home, like condiment jars, to practice on, or visit the glass section of your local thrift store. I think you'll find glass etching is pretty fun and a great way to personalize glass items. If you need more inspiration, visit our blog silhouette101.com. For help, you can reach out to Silhouette Support on silhouetteamerica.com. And be sure to check out our other videos on the Silhouette YouTube channel. Enjoy making your etched glass projects.